It's great to welcome back to the program Ben Burgis, who's a philosophy professor at Georgia State University Perimeter College, also author of the book Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. Ben has joined us before. Appreciate your time, Ben.
Oh, thanks for having me, good.
So, I've been talking to my audience about a concern of mine, which is that I'm seeing some who maybe in times past had a pretty clearly defined set of policy ideas that they found important. Sometimes they'd be socially democratic policy ideas, some are actual socialists. And I've seen the focus on the policy sort of replaced or preempted in some cases by a rhetoric that we would define as populist. And as people like Federico Finkelstein, for example, have written about extensively, that rhetoric often sounds very similar on the left and on the right, and can sometimes be used to sort of separate people from a defined set of policy ideas. And sometimes, in the worst of cases, people end up supporting candidates whose policy ideas, when it comes right down to it, are really antithetical to where they started. Let's open it there. Is this a concern that you share? If so, how are you seeing it manifest? If not, where am I wrong?
No, that's absolutely a concern that I'd share. I mean, I think like populism might be most helpfully thought of as a rhetorical style. There's the people, and there's some sort of elite, that you're counterposing the people to. And there's nothing wrong with that rhetorical style. That's how a lot of people that I like would frame things. That's how Bernie Sanders talks. But it's also a rhetorical style that you could use in service of all kinds of different political agendas. Um, there's certainly lots of right-wing versions of it, and it's in itself that's kind of empty, right? That doesn't actually tell you much of anything about whether somebody is going to do things that you'd like in terms of policy, whether they're even really on the same side of you as you are in terms of policy.
Yeah, one of the sort of corporate media players that has really benefited from the use of this rhetoric, I think, is Fox News' Tucker Carlson, who will
Mhm.
often frame a lot of issues as it's the people maybe against corporations, it's the people against elites, it's the people against whoever. But then he'll say, he'll warn you, make sure Black Lives Matter doesn't take your house or whatever.
Right.
And the solutions are very nationalistic, often xenophobic. Is this new? I mean, it seems to me that even if you go back to earlier 20th century Europe, there are examples of populist rhetoric being used, and it's sort of maybe not that clear whether we're talking about left or right populism, and it is sort of a gateway to some pretty severe authoritarianism.
Yeah, no, I mean that could certainly be true. Although I guess the point that I'd really emphasize as far as Tucker goes is that look, it's possible. Like, there's nothing that's impossible. There's nothing you can just rule out about the idea that you could have somebody who really did have some creepy right wing ideas about immigration or something else, who really could have some degree of redistributionism about economics. I think there are global examples of that. I think there are historical examples of that kind of thing. But in his case, I think that like the creepy right wing ideas about immigration are real, and the economic populism is pretty hollow. So he does talk like that, right? He'll criticize corporations for their lack of economic patriotism. He'll even criticize them sometimes for paying low wages. But then the obvious follow up question is, okay, so if the wages are too low, should we support raising the minimum wage? Should we change labor laws so it's easier for people in Amazon warehouses to unionize? And that other shoe never quite drops. He never really supports any of that stuff.
What's the prototypical example of what you alluded to, where in theory you could be sort of on the right but still support a sort of redistributive economic populism? Who would we look to as an example of that?
Yeah, uh, I think that there are. I think that certainly there are right wing and even fascist parties in Europe that certainly support more of that stuff than anybody like Tucker Carlson or Josh Hawley or any of these other alleged American right wing populists would. like the sort of, National Front types in France, places like that, granted, they're operating in a very different context where a lot of that stuff is already just sort of part of the accepted consensus. It's already happened, right? So of course they're gonna support it. And on some level, that might not even mean much because you think, okay, sure. And like British Tories say they support keeping the NHS, but they do sometimes at least appeal to saying that they would even increase, maybe certain sorts of social spending, if they were in power. And of course, who knows what they would actually do if they're in power. But I guess the point that I'd really want to emphasize is that this is something that you really don't get, right, in the American equivalent of most of these people, that they're really, it really isn't the case. Like when somebody like Steve Bannon talks about anything that he wants to do economically that would break from Republican orthodoxy, like once you really start digging into the details, right, because some of it, he says things like deconstruct the administrative state that sounds sort of vaguely radical. And then you think more about that, you're like, wait a second, do you just mean what everybody else in your party means by deregulation and
small government, etc.?
Yeah, right. And you start to dig into what he means, and I think maybe it's if Bannon had totally gotten his way in the Trump administration, maybe we'd be raising the top marginal tax rate to something closer to what it was in the Clinton years and spend some of the money on infrastructure spending. But then you ask obvious questions about, okay, but there are tens of millions of people who don't have health care. Are we going to do Medicare for all, or are we going to eliminate tuition at public universities? Or are we going to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour? And that's not something I ever see the Bannons or the Carlsons or the Howeys of the world really getting behind.
Can you talk a little bit about, or I guess maybe to frame this up, there's some interesting scholarship about how there's a link between populism and totalitarianism. And sometimes as soon as you broach that, people will say, are you saying populists are dictators? No, that's not the allegation that's being made. But can you talk a little bit about what that link is and where the overlap actually exists and what the limits of that are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a sense, there is at least one sense in which I want to push back on this a little bit, because I think that something that you often get from centrists certainly is this way, this sort of habit of demonizing populism in general, and using that word maybe even as a way of kind of associating good benevolent social democrats, like Bernie Sanders, with people who are right-wing populists who are more likely to have these authoritarian tendencies. And really, I mean, what I'm kind of criticizing when I say, hey, don't fall for Tucker Carlson's alleged economic populism, is the flip side of that, right? People who say, yeah, these things are good, and there's some commonality there, right, that I really don't think there is. But I do think it's true that if you think that the status quo is very bad, that you do set up some sort of opposition between the people and some kind of hostile elite, right? That certainly can go in an authoritarian direction. I mean, it's not. I mean, as we're having this conversation, Donald Trump, who often appeals to those things, just floated a trial balloon on Twitter about delaying the presidential election.
Yes.
So it's not like those sorts of concerns are just coming out of nowhere, that they're totally unfounded. But where I would hold the line is that I think you can have very positive left-wing movements that use populist framing, that really don't have those authoritarian tendencies, and really what I want to do is to separate these, right? That when we're just talking about populism, whether we put a plus next to it or a minus next to it,
yes,
the danger is that we end up conflating these things that really don't have a lot in common with each other.
When you look at the candidacy of somebody like Bernie Sanders as an example, just to sort of think about it, do you, in retrospect, Do you think that the campaign had the right balance of rhetoric and policy? Do you think that if it did, that there was something in terms of how it was received or understood that maybe was a missing link, or like where do you think that balance was when it comes to what you would like to see in order to keep clear, number one,
Yeah.
that the Bernie
Mhm.
populism is as you're pointing out not the type that would slide into authoritarianism as we're talking about, but at the same time that it is not removed from a specific set of policy ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think that whatever the the many problems may have been, with that movement, and obviously, something went wrong, right? Because back, because not very many months ago, the entire mainstream discussion was about whether if Bernie showed up at the Democratic convention with only a plurality of delegates, should he still be the nominee?
Yeah.
And it turned out that that wasn't the problem. But I certainly don't think that being light on policy detail was ever really the issue there. I mean, I think there were always it was always very good that way, right? I think that and certainly the kind of rhetoric about opposing interests was good in my view, right? I mean, like you should point out that this isn't just something that's like a sort of weird coincidence that something like Medicare for All has pulled as well as it has for as long as it has, and it's so marginal in terms of its chances of becoming reality politically. That there are structural reasons for this. Uh, that makes sense to me. I think that maybe part of the problem, and I don't want to let the Bernie campaign off the hook for mistakes that they undoubtedly did make. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, right? They lost, but
Yes.
but I also think that part of the reason that you do sometimes get this confusion, part of the reason you do get people who are even like Bernie Trump swing voters, which has been exaggerated, right? There are fewer of those certainly than there were Hillary McCain swing voters in 2008, but it is also true that there are people who would have voted for Bernie and who ended up voting for Trump, and there are people who I think would be receptive to a Bernie message who end up like watching Tucker Carlson and nodding along with everything that he says. And I think that the reason for that is bigger than any mistakes that Bernie people may have made in 2016 or 2020, because what Bernie was speaking to was this kind of larger hunger for for some kind of message that identified the sense that a lot of people have of reality. That the game is rigged against them. That there's that we're not just sort of having this neutral policy discussion about what the best way to go about solving these problems is. That politics is catering to the interests of a relatively small minority of the population and many issues, right? And that's not a sense that people have that's wrong, right? That's right. And I think that when there are so few people who are really speaking to it, and especially in a relatively effective, compelling way, that it does make some sense that people would be a little bit of a cheap date about it. That all it takes is Tucker Carlson going on Fox and talking about how American workers have gotten a raw deal and saying some bad stuff about Jeff Bezos, and that a lot of people could hear that and say, hey, there's somebody who's telling it like it is. He must be on their side. And then you sort of don't, like, if you're happy about that, right? You're happy to have that spoken to, then you sort of it's way too easy to miss the fact that when it comes to what concretely to do about this, right? Other than than this kind of cruel, strict enforcement of immigration laws, and kind of going back to historic Republican protectionism, right? Like, I'm pretty sure from the 1850s to the 1950s, the Republican Party was more protectionist than Trump is now, right? And nobody mistook them for champions of ordinary people at the expense of American business interests. That like if that's all he's saying, or like there's a famous segment where Tucker is praising something Elizabeth Warren said about economic patriotism, and and people have pointed that out to me often, in the course of these discussions, like, hey, look at how there's some convergence between the right and the moderate left on this, that he's praising this economic statement by Elizabeth Warren. But I remember watching that. It's like, once you get to the end, right, the very end of it, where he actually starts talking about policy, like the only specific Warren policy items he endorses there are more apprenticeship programs and the government should buy American where possible, which, given the scale of the poverty, the lack of health insurance, the ridiculous wages, everything that is the actual discontent that he's speaking to, that's almost farcically little to actually give people as far as policy solutions.
Yeah, once you get to the policy part, it completely falls apart. We're going to go to a break on the podcast, TV, and radio show, but my full conversation with Ben will be on our YouTube channel. So I want to get your thoughts on the election that's coming up in a very particular context, which is, it's often popular to say this is the most important election of our lifetime, and in some sense, the next one is always the most important because it's the next one. But there's a feeling that I did not have in 2012, for example, when Barack Obama was running for re-election and Mitt Romney was running against him. And yes, they had different economic policies, but it felt like the economy by traditional measures was going to continue being pretty solid for the following 4 years. It didn't seem nearly as consequential as this one does in terms of setting the direction of the country in a way where there could be more irreversible damage done if Donald Trump gets another 4 years. That's the context that I'm looking at this election through, and I'm wondering whether you would agree, partially agree, or where you are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is pretty consequential. What makes it a little bit hard to make that argument is, as you kind of alluded to, so many progressives have cried wolf on this so many times, right? We've heard so many times this election, that election is the most important election ever. I've heard so many times that, George Bush is a fascist, Nixon was a fascist, right? That those things start to ring a little bit hollow, and it really is, and it really is possible even now, right? Like now that Trump's doing stuff like tweeting about delaying the election and sending federal troops to shove people into unmarked vans. So he's certainly doing his best to live up to some of that hype, right? But it's still easy because so many people are rightly alarmed by Trump that they've also, even when it comes to Trump, they've cried wolf on certain things. They've seen like played up lots of things about Trump that didn't necessarily always turn out to be right. But I actually think that one way to sort of see the stakes of the election is to sort of take it down a notch and see that in terms of actually a lot of the reasons that it would have even been bad if Mitt Romney had been elected president, it's also bad that if Trump were elected, and some of that might, relative to everything I just said, seems sort of low stakes or even weird to focus on, like, he was having people, shoved in unmarked vans. Why are you talking about this kind of nitty gritty, economic policy stuff? But at the same time, it is really worth thinking about because if you do want to, do something about all those larger problems we were talking about in the initial segment, that, you want to, that you think that we do need the sort of political possibility that was represented by the Bernie movement, that we do need to do something real about poverty and economic inequality, then it really is very bad that that Trump is, for example, filling the National Labor Relations Board with people who want to stamp out unions, that the the judicial appointments certainly reflect that. I mean, this kind of mundane stuff like that. I actually think as far as like the long-term prospects for the left is fairly terrifying. And I guess the way that I would frame this is I don't think that I think that if we sound really alarmist and we're also telling people a story about Biden that they maybe know isn't quite right, then I
Mm.
think that a lot of people are not going to respond to that, and they're going to not really be that motivated to necessarily vote because it's not like, I mean, look,
Well, can
the
you
Republic,
before we get too far,
yeah.
can you talk? What would be the story? I guess to be clear, what would be the story about Biden that would be the not really true one?
That he basically agrees with the left. He's like maybe just a little bit more moderate and incremental, but the way, but like the sort of thing that people are getting at when they use phrases like, well, he's not perfect, right?
Mm.
Like, hey, he's not perfect, but you're still getting a lot of what you want, etc. And I would argue, right? I don't know what your perspective is, but I would argue that's not quite an accurate way of putting it, and that's one that's maybe even a counterproductive way of putting it, because a lot of people who you'd have to sort of most worry about not pulling that lever, or I guess checking the thing on your mail-in ballot, for Biden, uh, are kind of rightly have a sense that the differences go a lot deeper than that, right? That it's not a matter, Biden isn't like the 10% more flawed version of Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren, right? I think that Biden is somebody with which, certainly the left, anybody who I think is more meaningfully an economic populist, has some very deep disagreements.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I guess my take on this is I
Yeah,
think that saying Biden's not perfect or he's like 10% short of Bernie is certainly inaccurate and counterproductive. So I would
yeah.
completely agree with you there. I do think, though, that there's probably a lot of being said about Biden that doesn't really look deeply
Mm,
at, for example, his tax proposal, which
hmm.
does things that, I mean, again, it's all context, but uncapping Social Security tax
Hmm.
above $400,000. I mean, that's very, very big. And that if he were president, that's arguably unprecedented. Now, could he get it done? Okay. Can any president? I mean, I don't think Bernie was going to get
Sure.
Medicare for all done, and that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
When you look at clean energy, for
Hmm.
example, he's being attacked by some on the left for copying stuff from Bernie. When I thought that's sort of what we wanted, he's attacked by the right because his plan is too aggressive, which I like. I want a plan that's too
Yeah.
aggressive, and okay, maybe we fall short. So I guess my view on it is these umbrella terms like, okay, Biden's not perfect. Yeah, it's meaningless and it's counterproductive. But the more I look into the policy, I come away, oh, this is more left than maybe I thought. And that, when the alternative is Trump, makes me feel more confident about what the right decision is. I guess is where I would leave it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd just say that Biden. Okay, so there are two things. One is uh, just how seriously to take some of these commitments.
Which I think is a question with any candidate. And the
Of
problem is if
course,
you want to focus on that, then you're just judging sincerity, which is really tough.
it is tough, but I think that you can make some informed judgments about that, right? By looking certainly certainly at people's records, certainly by looking at like what is kind of on a website somewhere and what somebody really emphasizes.
Sure.
Uh, and I'd also, and then the second thing that is that a question not necessarily even of what you could get done, which, as you say, I mean, like there are enormous obstacles, right? Who knows what anybody would actually get done at the end of the day.
Yep.
But what somebody would really be motivated to expend political capital trying to get done, which might not even be the same thing as the first question about what they really, what they really mean, right?
Yeah.
Because there might be things a politician, would be perfectly happy to do if it wasn't a big deal, right? But wouldn't necessarily prioritize, right? So I mean, I think like an obvious example, like with the Obama administration, would be card check, right? Which is something they talked about in 2008, and then very quickly became a distant memory, which I don't even think is like, Obama was lying, right? When he said that he wanted card check. I think he would have been totally fine with it, but I think that it was never something. It was never something that was going to be a priority. Now, which specific things are in which of these boxes, for Biden, I mean, I think without getting too granular about trying to guess that, right, which is what a lot of this is anyway, is guesswork. I also think that if you take a step back, it's like, okay, yeah, even if you're pretty cynical about a lot of this, that doesn't mean that the outcome of the election is inconsequential, that we shouldn't care, that there's no difference, that the things people say to me on Twitter, like where it's like, oh, it's literally not even harm reduction, right? That's silly,
Yeah.
right? Like that, because even if you have a pretty cynical view of this stuff, then it's still the case that that Biden appointees to the courts, to the NLRB, are not going to be trying to stamp out organized labor. That you're not going to that you're not going to have these attempts to get rid of the last lingering shreds of Obamacare. That the sort of aggressive attempts to carry out, again, could go back to theme, about the least meaningfully economically populist agenda that you can imagine, right? That you've gotten from the Trump administration are not going to happen. And of course, we haven't even gotten into like how the pandemic is handled, or some things like that, right? And so I guess the point I'd make is that you can think Biden is pretty bad, but still think, okay, like let's say I see both of these people, as my enemy, and I'm going to be fighting against both of them on certain things for the next 4 years, depending on what's going to happen. That doesn't mean that I can't make strategic choices about who I would rather be fighting about what issues.
Yeah, I think that's very well said in the context of sort of the movement that you're describing and some of their skepticism, and sometimes getting to that 2016 idea of Hillary or Trump. It's kind of it's not really going to make a huge difference. Part of this may be an ideological difference in terms of incrementalism versus not. I mean, when I look at what I consider to be the three biggest eras over the last 130, 40 years of progressive advancement in the US, I look at progressive era, 1890 to 1920. I look at New Deal era and late 50s into 60s, early 70s civil rights era. And so much, if you go back, a lot of what happened was the Supreme Court had the right makeup to uphold really important things in the teens and 20s and in the New Deal era and civil rights era, and et cetera. And that seems to be supportive of recognizing the differences between which judges would Biden pick versus Trump. And that's sort of like my framework, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of judicial appointees is incredibly consequential, right? No doubt about that. Like I mean, look, that the Supreme Court just very recently, even though, right, they've made some like nice socially liberal rulings that we both nod along to, on things like gay and trans rights, they on questions that have to do with the economic structure of society, it's been incredibly destructive that the Supreme Court just within the last couple of years eliminated closed shops in the in the public sector. With Janus, that's eliminated agency fees, which and thus forced unions to represent people that they can't be funded by.
Right.
And again, if you don't, and so even though I think we might have a different perspective on some of the incremental stuff, right? I get very frustrated with that conversation sometimes because I think, my God, right? Like, if we were talking about, workers' control of the means of production, you're saying, let's take a little slow, right? I don't understand that conversation, but, I think transitioning to Canada's healthcare system seems pretty incremental to me, but at the same time, it's, if you don't have a strong organized workers movement at the base, right? If you don't have strong unions,
Yeah.
then I think historically you're not going to get any kind of, you're not going to get a very successful left politically on top. And so if you're not paying attention to that issue, I mean, I think a lot of the rest of it is to some extent just kind of howling into the wind, and the appointments matter a lot for that. That again, Janus happened, just in the last couple of years. That's incredibly destructive. They've even before that, right? The decisions about opening the floodgates on campaign finance. I mean, all of these things, are very important. And even though, even though there are lots of decisions that are made by lots of Democratic appointed judges, that I don't like at all, that they're not going to make decisions like that. Like it is actually pretty important, whether you have Democratic appointed judges who are going to operate within a certain framework as far as things like, hey, should we basically have public sector unions? That's going to be extremely different from the kind of framework that Republican judges are going to operate in.
Unquestionably, yeah. And I think no disagreement there, it sounds like. And certainly I think with the other stuff, the audience will get a sense of maybe where we differ. We've been speaking with Ben Burgis, who's a philosophy professor at Georgia State University Perimeter College, also author of the book Give Them an Argument: Logic for the Left. Ben, great to see you, and I so appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you so much, David.